A king slipped home from the Crusades disguised as a common pilgrim, dodging enemies he had made along the way. A boy in his own party paying for supplies with a gold coin no pilgrim should own was enough to unravel it. Within weeks a kingdom was melting down church silver to buy him back. Today, 10 medieval kidnappings that shook royal courts to their core. The costliest one is saved for last. Number 10. The kidnapping of Piers Gaveston. Edward II of England did not just favor Piers Gaveston. He built his entire early reign around him, showered him with titles, land, and the earldom of Cornwall, and treated the barons who actually ran the kingdom's day-to-day business like background furniture. Gaveston had a gift for mockery, and he used it freely, handing out cruel nicknames to some of the most powerful men in England to their faces. The barons hated him for the insults. They hated him more for the power. By the spring of 1312, a coalition of earls had decided Gaveston's influence over the king had gone on long enough, and this time they meant to end it for good. Gaveston took refuge at Scarborough Castle on the Yorkshire coast, besieged almost immediately by forces led by the Earl of Pembroke and a coalition of allied lords. Trapped, poorly supplied, and with no relief coming, Gaveston agreed to surrender, but only after Pembroke personally swore an oath guaranteeing his safety, and promised to escort him south for a fair hearing before the king and council. That oath lasted about as long as the journey did. While Pembroke stopped for the night at Dedington in Oxfordshire and left Gaveston lightly guarded at a nearby rectory, the Earl of Warwick, a nobleman remembered by chroniclers under the nickname the Black Dog of Arden, rode in with an armed company, seized the king's favorite from his own escort, and carried him off to Warwick Castle in chains. It was not an enemy army pulling Gaveston from a battlefield. It was one nobleman's sworn word broken by another nobleman in the middle of the night, against a prisoner who had already surrendered under a promise of safety. At Warwick Castle, a small group of earls held something between a council and a show trial, and condemned Gaveston to death without any real pretense of a fair hearing. Then came a detail that says everything about how carefully even a lawless killing observed the fine print of feudal law. Warwick Castle itself sat on land where the earls were not entirely comfortable carrying out an execution, so before going through with it, they marched their prisoner out across the county line onto land belonging to the Earl of Lancaster, the most powerful noble behind the plot, so that the killing would happen on the correct jurisdiction. Men willing to break a sworn oath of safe conduct still paused to get the geography of the murder right. On Blacklow Hill on the 19th of June, 1312, 2 Welsh soldiers ran Gaveston through and then cut off his head, while the Earl of Lancaster reportedly watched from a distance, close enough to witness it, far enough to keep his own hands technically clean. Edward II, informed of his favorite's death, was said to have grieved with a rawness that shocked even his enemies, and the killing poisoned relations between the king and his greatest barons for the rest of his reign, a wound that never fully closed. Edward would spend years working through the men responsible one by one, and the pattern set at Dedington, a king's closest companion seized from a broken promise and executed without real trial, would echo forward into Edward's own reign in ways nobody at Blacklow Hill could have predicted. 15 years later, English barons would come for a king the same way they had once come for his favorite. The Earl of Pembroke never got over the humiliation of that broken oath, and it cost the plotters more than they expected. Pembroke had staked his personal honor on Gaveston's safety, and finding his own sworn word overridden by Warwick in the middle of the night turned him from a cautious moderate inside the baronial coalition into one of its angriest critics, a nobleman who spent months afterward refusing to fully reconcile with the men who had made him complicit in a killing he had explicitly promised would not happen. A pattern worth watching for across the rest of this list is starting to take shape already at item 10. A broken promise rarely stays contained to the two people standing closest to it. None of this came out of nowhere. Gaveston had already been exiled 3 times before that final siege, once by Edward II's own father, King Edward I, who found the friendship between his heir and this landless Gascon knight so troubling that he banished Gaveston from the kingdom outright, and twice more by barons who forced Edward II to send his favorite away as the price of their cooperation. Every time, Edward brought him straight back the moment he had the power to do it, showering him with even more land and titles than before, as if daring the barons to try stopping him again. They did, for good. The Deddington ambush was not a sudden burst of baronial rage. It was the final act of a decade-long standoff between a king who refused to give up his closest companion and a nobility that had decided, once and for all, they would rather break a sworn oath than watch it happen a 5th time. That is where this list has to start, with a broken oath and a beheading on a hillside chosen for its paperwork. The next kidnapping did not need an ambush or a broken promise at all. It only needed one brother beating another on an open battlefield, and 28 years to make the point stick. Number 9. The Kidnapping of Robert Curthose. William the Conqueror left 3 sons behind when he died in 1087, and he split his conquests between them in a way almost guaranteed to start a war. The eldest, Robert Curthose, inherited the ancestral duchy of Normandy. A younger son, William Rufus, inherited the prize, the Kingdom of England. When William Rufus died in a hunting accident in 1100, the youngest brother of all, Henry, raced to seize the English treasury and crown before Robert, still away on crusade, even learned the throne was open. Robert came home to find his own inheritance quietly stolen out from under him by his baby brother. For 6 years the two brothers circled each other, through an aborted invasion, a negotiated treaty, and a peace that satisfied nobody. Henry wanted Normandy. Robert wanted the English crown he believed should have been his by right of age alone. In 1106, Henry crossed the Channel with an army and forced the issue at Tinchebray, and this time there was no truce left to fall back on. Robert's Norman forces were broken in the field, and Robert himself, Duke of Normandy, was captured by his own brother's soldiers and dragged before the new master of both England and Normandy in one afternoon. What Henry did next was not an execution. It was something crueler in its own quiet way. He kept his brother alive and simply never let him go. Robert was moved between a string of English and Welsh castles over the following decades, held under guard but treated by most accounts with a strange kind of comfort, loud music, hunting within the castle grounds, and the company of attendants, the trappings of a nobleman's household, wrapped entirely around a life he could never leave. Some later chroniclers claimed Henry had his brother blinded at one point to prevent any attempt to reclaim power, a detail modern historians treat with real skepticism, given how thin the evidence is. But the plain, undisputed fact needs no exaggeration to land. A Duke of Normandy spent the last 28 years of his life as a prisoner of his own family. Robert died in captivity at Cardiff Castle in 1134, reportedly in his early 80s, having outlived nearly everyone who remembered him as anything other than a prisoner. Henry himself died the following year, which means the jailer barely survived his captive by 12 months, after a lifetime spent making absolutely certain his older brother would never again threaten his throne. 28 years is longer than most medieval reigns lasted outright. Robert Curthose spent almost the entirety of it locked away for the crime of losing one battle to a brother who wanted everything he had. The bitterest irony is what Robert had been before all of this. Years earlier, he had marched east on the First Crusade as one of its most respected commanders, present at the siege and capture of Jerusalem itself in 1099, a genuine hero of Christendom's greatest religious triumph of the age. He came home from the Holy Land a celebrated warrior, only to spend nearly 3 decades afterward as a forgotten prisoner in his own brother's castles, his crusading fame slowly fading from a Europe that had moved on to other wars and other heroes while he sat under guard in Wales. A man who once stood inside the walls of Jerusalem died inside the walls of Cardiff, and almost nobody outside the castle noticed the difference between the two kinds of confinement. A brother's ambition bought Robert Curthose 28 years behind castle walls. The next kidnapping on this list did not even need a battle. It only needed a king who saw a rival's bride and decided the fastest way to neutralize an entire enemy family was simply to marry her himself. Number 8. The Kidnapping of Isabella of Angouleme. By the summer of 1200, King John of England had a marriage problem. His first wife, Isabella of Gloucester, had been quietly set aside through an annulment that conveniently ignored any real objection from her family, freeing John to make a second, far more strategic match. Across his continental territories in southwestern France, a betrothal had already been arranged that threatened to become John's worst nightmare. The young heiress Isabella of Angouleme promised in marriage to Hugh the Ninth of Lusignan, Count of La Marche. Combine Angouleme and La Marche under one Lusignan ruler, and John would suddenly have a single hostile lordship sitting directly across the road, connecting his most valuable French territories. A strategic knife pointed straight at the heart of his continental holdings. John did not need to storm a castle or drag anyone off in chains to solve the problem. He simply outmaneuvered the Lusignans at their own game, working directly with Isabella's father, Count Aymer of Angouleme, and securing the marriage for himself in August of 1200, taking Isabella, reportedly barely 12 years old at the time, as his own queen instead of letting her marry into the family John needed broken apart. It was not a kidnapping in the sense of soldiers and a locked wagon. It was a colder, more calculating theft, a king simply outbidding a rival for a bride who had never been asked what she wanted in the first place, and walking away with both the girl and the strategic prize she represented. The Lusignans did not accept the insult quietly. Robbed of the marriage and the territory it would have secured, Hugh and his family rose in open revolt across John's French territories, and crucially, appealed the matter to the one authority John could not simply ignore, his own feudal overlord, King Philip II of France. As Duke of Aquitaine and Normandy, John technically owed Philip the same obedience any vassal owed a lord, and the Lusignans demanded Philip summon John to answer for the marriage before the royal court in Paris. John refused to appear. Under the feudal law of the era, a vassal who ignored a lawful summons from his overlord could be judged to have forfeited his fiefs entirely. And Philip, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening for years, declared John's continental territories confiscated. What followed was not a quick punishment. Philip spent the next several years methodically conquering Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, English-held territory John's family had ruled for generations, until by 1204 the vast majority of it was gone for good, folded permanently into the Kingdom of France. A marriage meant to protect John's continental holdings ended up handing his enemy the legal justification to strip most of them away entirely. A strategic victory that turned into one of the costliest self-inflicted disasters in Plantagenet history. Isabella herself outlived John by well over a decade, and history saved one last, almost mischievous twist for her. After John's death, she returned to Angouleme and eventually married Hugh X of Lusignan, son of the very man she had been taken from as a girl, quietly reuniting with the family. Her first marriage had been designed to cut off at the knees. The kidnapping that was never technically a kidnapping cost England most of its French empire and, one generation later, resolved itself anyway. John's own conduct in the months right after the wedding did little to help his case with contemporaries. The chronicler Roger of Wendover, writing not long afterward, described a king so absorbed in his new marriage that he lingered in bed with his young bride through the mornings while his enemies mobilized, and his continental territories began slipping away around him. An image later historians have treated with some caution, given how eagerly monastic chroniclers love to moralize about a king's private failings, but one that stuck to John's reputation regardless, feeding directly into the picture of a ruler who traded strategic judgment for a prize he had simply wanted for himself. Chroniclers writing not long after the marriage made little effort to hide their discomfort with it. John was somewhere in his early 30s at the time. Isabella, by most estimates, was barely 12, an age gap even contemporary writers accustomed to political child marriages found worth commenting on, and several chronicles frame the whole affair less as romance than as raw appetite dressed up in the language of strategy. A king who wanted what a rival had and simply took it because nobody in a position to stop him chose to try. Whatever mixture of calculation and desire actually drove the decision, the political fallout would have been the same either way. A stolen bride cost John an empire. The next kidnapping on this list cost a teenage prince his life, and to this day nobody has ever found the body. Number 7. The kidnapping of Arthur of Brittany. Arthur of Brittany had a claim to the English throne that made his uncle John deeply uneasy, and with good reason. Arthur was the son of John's older brother Geoffrey, which meant that, under a strict reading of primogeniture, the nephew rather than the younger brother arguably held the better right to the crown. Backed by King Philip II of France, who saw an obvious opportunity to weaken John from within his own family, Arthur spent his teenage years as the figurehead of a real challenge to his uncle's throne, a 15-year-old boy positioned as the alternative king of the Angevin world. In the summer of 1202, Arthur made his move, joining an assault on the castle of Mirbeau, where John's own mother, the elderly and formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, had taken refuge. John responded with a speed that startled everyone, marching his army through an entire night to cover the distance and catch the besiegers completely by surprise at dawn. The garrison, expecting a long siege, instead found the King of England at their gates before sunrise. Arthur and a large group of rebel barons were captured in the chaos, and John suddenly held not just a rival claimant, but the son of his own dead brother, in his personal custody. Arthur was first imprisoned at Falaise, then transferred to the castle at Rouen, held under conditions that grew steadily more secretive as the months passed. Then in the spring of 1203, Arthur simply vanished. No public trial, no announced execution, no body ever produced or identified for burial. One contemporary chronicle, written at Margam Abbey in Wales not long after the events, claimed that John himself, drunk and enraged, killed his nephew personally one night, and had the body weighted and thrown into the Seine. A specific and grim account modern historians treat carefully rather than as settled fact, since no other independent source confirms the details, and no physical evidence has ever surfaced to prove it. What is not disputed is that a 15-year-old rival claimant to the throne went into John's custody alive, and was never seen again by anyone outside it. The disappearance did more damage to John than almost anything he could have done on an actual battlefield. Rumor of the murder spread fast through the continental nobility, and King Philip used it exactly the way he had used the Isabella affair 3 years earlier, summoning John to the French royal court to answer publicly for his nephew's fate. John again refused to appear, and Philip again declared his continental fiefs forfeit, this time with the added weight of a missing, presumed murdered teenage prince hanging over every accusation. Within 2 years, Normandy itself, the very heartland of John's family's power since William the Conqueror crossed the Channel over a century earlier, was gone. Arthur was not the only member of his family John took captive that summer. His younger sister, Eleanor of Brittany, remembered by later writers as the Pearl of Brittany for her own claim to the English throne, was captured in the same campaign and handed the same fate her brother received, permanent custody in England. Unlike Arthur, Eleanor was never killed and never released either. She spent the rest of her entire life, close to 40 years, moved between English castles under guard, unmarried and childless by design, since any husband or heir she produced could have revived the very claim John had gone to such lengths to bury with her brother. Arthur's disappearance is the mystery historians still argue over. His sister's fate needed no mystery at all. Just 4 decades of a woman kept alive specifically so she would never matter. The night march on Meyerbeau deserves its own moment of credit, because it is the one detail from this entire episode that nobody seriously disputes. John's army covered a punishing distance in a single continuous push, riding and marching through the dark without the rest an army usually needed before a fight, arriving at Meyerbeau's walls while the besiegers were still confident they controlled the situation. It remains one of the most effective forced marches of John's entire reign, a rare moment of genuine military competence from a king, better remembered for losing territory than seizing it. And it is precisely that competence that makes what happened to Arthur afterward so much harder to explain away as simple bad luck. Nobody has ever found where Arthur of Brittany is buried, if he was buried at all. Of every unsolved mystery on this list, his remains the coldest case, a claim to the throne that simply stopped existing along with the boy who held it. And it is worth noticing the pattern taking shape by this point in the list. 2 kidnappings in, both tied to the same king, both aimed at securing his throne, and both ended up costing him almost the entire continental empire his family had spent a century building. The next kidnapping on this list did not target a rival or a rebel at all. It targeted a 12-year-old boy being sent away from danger, on a ship that never should have been a target in the first place. Number 6. The kidnapping of James I of Scotland. By the early years of the 1400s, King Robert III of Scotland had already lost one son to circumstances that still unsettle historians. His elder boy, David, died in confinement under the custody of his own uncle, the Duke of Albany, in conditions some chroniclers describe as outright starvation. Terrified of losing his surviving heir, a boy named James, barely 12 years old, Robert made the decision to send him across the sea to the French royal court for safekeeping, away from the ambitious relatives circling closer to the Scottish throne. With every year, the king's health declined. The plan should have been safe. Scotland and England were, at that moment, observing an official truce, and a ship carrying a child to a foreign court under a truce was not supposed to be a legitimate target for anyone. It was intercepted anyway. In the spring of 1406, English privateers seized the vessel off Flamborough Head on the Yorkshire coast, and the young heir to the Scottish crown found himself a prisoner of the very kingdom his father had hoped a truce would keep him safe from. He was handed over to King Henry IV of England, who reportedly remarked, with a dark kind of humor, that he might as well see to the boy's education himself, since the Scots did not appear capable of doing it. Word of the capture reached Robert III before his son had even finished the crossing into English custody, and according to the chroniclers of the time, the news broke him completely. He died within days, reportedly refusing food, a king who succumbed to grief over a son who was, as far as anyone in Scotland knew, now a hostage in a foreign court with no fixed end date on his imprisonment. James inherited the Scottish throne the moment his father died, becoming king of a country he could not set foot in, at the exact moment his own captivity in England began in earnest. That captivity lasted 18 years, spanning the reigns of 3 different English kings, Henry IV, then Henry V, then the long regency around the infant Henry VI. It was not a cruel imprisonment in the dungeon sense. James received a genuine education, was taught alongside members of the English nobility, developed a real talent for poetry that survives to this day, and eventually fell in love with Joan Beaufort, a well-connected kinswoman of the English royal family, whom he would go on to marry. But every comfort still came wrapped around one unavoidable fact: a king of Scotland who had never ruled his own kingdom, growing into adulthood entirely inside the household of the country holding him hostage. James finally returned to Scotland in 1424 under the Treaty of London, freed in exchange for a large ransom, dressed up diplomatically as a bride's dowry payment for Joan. The king who came home was nothing like the frightened 12-year-old who had been pulled off a ship 18 years earlier. He returned determined, occasionally ruthless, and visibly shaped by nearly 2 decades of watching how English kings kept control over restless nobles. Lessons he applied at home with a hard hand against Scottish lords who had grown far too comfortable during his long absence. It cost him. In 1437, a group of conspirators from among those same resentful nobles murdered him in his own lodgings. A king who survived 18 years as another kingdom's hostage only to be killed by his own countrymen once he was finally, fully free. 18 years is long enough to learn exactly what unchecked baronial power can do to a kingdom, and James came home determined to make sure nobody forgot the lesson. Within a year of his return, he moved directly against the family of the Duke of Albany, the same relative whose custody had already cost his brother David his life decades earlier, arresting Albany's sons and putting them on trial for treason. 2 of them were executed in short order, a purge carried out with a coldness that startled even nobles who had expected the returning king to want some kind of reckoning. The gentle, poetry-writing captive who had spent 18 years watching English kings manage their own troublesome lords came home and applied precisely the lesson he had learned, just aimed at his own family this time. The poetry James wrote during those years survives, most famously a long autobiographical work known as the King's Quair, in which he describes looking down from his tower window and seeing a woman walking in the garden below, the moment tradition connects directly to his first sight of Joan Beaufort, the captive's gaze turning a prison window into the setting of what he himself called the start of his own story. It is a strange kind of artifact, a king writing tenderly about the very window that once defined the limits of his entire world, and it remains one of the few times on this list where a kidnapping victim left behind, in his own words, exactly what the experience felt like from the inside. A father died of grief over a kidnapping that made his son king before he ever ruled a single day of it. The next kidnapping on this list involves a battlefield so catastrophic for one side that the man at its center was found only because searchers happened to notice he was still breathing under a pile of the dead. Number 5. The kidnapping of Charles, Duke of Orleans. Charles, Duke of Orleans, stood near the very top of the French royal family tree, nephew of the mentally unstable King Charles VI, and one of the most powerful nobles in a kingdom, already tearing itself apart through civil war between rival factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. When King Henry V of England invaded France in 1415, chasing a claim to the French crown itself, Charles rode out with the French army as one of its senior commanders, expecting the kind of engagement French chivalry had dominated for generations. The Battle of Agincourt, fought on the 25th of October, 1415, delivered instead one of the most lopsided disasters in the history of French arms. Narrow, mud-choked ground, driving rain, and a devastating hail of English arrows turned the famous flower of French nobility into a crushed, trampled mass in a matter of hours, thousands of armored men dead or dying in a killing field barely wide enough to hold them all. When English searchers combed the aftermath, They found Charles among the corpses, pulled out from beneath a pile of the dead, still alive, having apparently survived the crush of bodies that suffocated so many other armored men trapped beneath their own comrades. Being found alive did not mean being set free. Charles was taken to England and held for 25 years, moved between a series of castles including spells inside the Tower of London itself, while ransom negotiations dragged on for decades without resolution. The English crown had good reason to keep stalling. Charles remained a politically dangerous figure back home, entangled in the ongoing feud between Armagnacs and Burgundians, and releasing him risked handing France a rallying point precisely when England most needed the French Civil War to keep tearing the country apart from within. What Charles did with those 25 years is the detail that elevates his captivity above almost every other imprisonment on this list. Rather than simply waiting out the decades in bitterness, he wrote poetry, a substantial body of it composed in both French and English, filled with reflections on longing, exile, and the strange suspended existence of a man whose entire adult life was happening somewhere he was not permitted to be. Historians now count him among the finest poets medieval France produced, an entire literary legacy that exists only because a duke had nothing but time and English castle walls for a quarter of a century. Charles was finally released in 1440, an old man by the standards of the era, returning to a France he barely recognized. The boy King Charles VII he remembered from before Agincourt was now a hardened, battle-tested ruler who had spent the Duke's captivity fighting Joan of Arc's war and clawing France back from the edge of English conquest entirely without him. A quarter century is long enough for an entire kingdom to remake itself, while one man simply waits in another country to see if anyone still remembers he exists. While Charles sat in English castles composing verse about longing and distant homelands, the war he had ridden out to fight at Agincourt kept going without him, carried for years by his own illegitimate half-brother, a commander history remembers as the Bastard of Orleans, who fought alongside Joan of Arc during the campaigns that finally turned the war back in France's favor. The family name that opened doors for Charles at the French court also handed real battlefield command to a brother born outside it. And by the time the legitimate duke finally came home, the bastard half-brother he had left behind as a boy had become one of the most celebrated soldiers in French history. A reversal of fortune neither of them could have predicted the day Charles rode out toward Agincourt. Charles turned a quarter century of captivity into poetry that outlived every soldier at Agincourt. The next kidnapping on this list did not happen on a battlefield or a besieged castle at all. It happened while the victim was simply out riding, ambushed by men who called him family. Number 4. The kidnapping of Wenceslas IV of Bohemia. Wenceslas IV inherited the Bohemian crown and the title of King of the Romans while still a teenager, and grew into a ruler who managed to alienate nearly every powerful family in his own kingdom through a mixture of erratic governing, heavy drinking, and long stretches of simply losing interest in the daily business of ruling. By the early 1390s, a coalition of Bohemian nobles had run out of patience, among them men who were not distant rivals but Wenceslas's own relatives, led in large part by his cousin Jobst of Moravia, alongside the powerful Rosenberg family. In the spring of 1394, that coalition made its move in the most unceremonious way imaginable. Wenceslas was ambushed while out riding, seized directly off his horse by armed men working for his own cousin, and hauled away as a prisoner of the very nobility he was supposed to command. There was no battlefield defeat to explain it away, no siege, no dramatic last stand, just a king pulled from his saddle on an ordinary ride and thrown into confinement by his own extended family. He was held for months, moved between locations, while his captors used his imprisonment as leverage to force through a package of political concessions, stripping away royal authority and handing effective control of the kingdom to a regency council dominated by the same nobles who had just kidnapped him. Wenceslas's freedom, when it finally came, arrived largely through the intervention of his younger half-brother, John of Gorlitz, who negotiated and pressured the captors into releasing the king, positioning himself as the loyal relative who had rescued Wenceslas from the family members who had betrayed him. That rescue makes what happened 8 years later almost unbearably ironic in a different way. In 1402, another half-brother entirely, Sigismund, had Wenceslas arrested and imprisoned again, this time in Vienna, in a dispute over control of the Holy Roman imperial title. One half-brother had played the rescuer. Another played the captor. It was a betrayal that left Wenceslas unable to trust even the family members who had once seemingly stood by him. Wenceslas never fully recovered the authority he lost during those 2 imprisonments. His grip on Bohemia weakened for the rest of his reign, and the political instability that followed him is one of the threads historians trace forward into the religious and social upheaval that erupted into the Hussite Wars within months of his death, and then raged on for the next decade and a half. A kingdom whose troubles began, in no small part, with a king who could not even trust his own family enough to go for a ride in peace. Wenceslas's troubles with his own church hierarchy were already boiling over even before the ambush. The year before his cousin's coalition seized him, Wenceslas had clashed bitterly with the Archbishop of Prague over the church's independence from royal authority, a dispute that ended, according to accounts from the period, with one of the archbishop's own vicars general, a churchman remembered today as John of Nepomuk, drowned in the Vieltava River on the king's orders, a killing later folded into legend and sainthood, but rooted, at the time, in a very real and very ugly power struggle between a volatile king and the clergy who were supposed to answer to him. A ruler already accused of drowning a priest over a jurisdictional dispute was not exactly starting from a position of trust when his own cousin decided enough was enough. A king was kidnapped by his cousin, rescued by one brother, then kidnapped again by another years later. The next kidnapping on this list did not target a king or a duke at all. It targeted the one man in Christendom who was supposed to answer to nobody but God. Number 3. The kidnapping of Pope Boniface VIII. By the turn of the 14th century, Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip, the Fourth of France, were locked in one of the most dangerous power struggles the medieval church had ever seen. Philip wanted the right to tax French clergy without asking Rome's permission. Boniface answered by issuing a papal bull asserting, in the most sweeping terms the papacy had ever used, that spiritual authority stood above every earthly crown, popes included, kings included, no exceptions. It was a direct challenge to the entire foundation of Philip's power, and Philip decided the only real answer was to remove the man making the challenge. Philip's chief minister, a lawyer named Guillaume de Nogaret, traveled south into Italy and joined forces with Sira Colonna, a member of a rival Roman noble family that had its own long-running blood feud with Boniface entirely separate from the French dispute. On the 7th of September, 1303, their combined force of armed men rode into Anagni, the small hill town outside Rome where Boniface, now around 68 years old, had been born and had returned to spend the late summer. His household guards scattered almost immediately, offering essentially no resistance to men who had ridden in specifically to seize the Pope. What happened next is one of the most vividly remembered scenes in medieval history. Rather than flee or hide, the elderly Pope reportedly put on his full papal regalia, seated himself on his throne, and waited for the intruders to reach him, refusing to give his enemies the satisfaction of finding him cowering. Tradition holds that Sira Kalana struck the Pope across the face, a moment later immortalized by the poet Dante, as a wound inflicted on Christ himself through his vicar on earth, though the exact details of the blow come down through sources written with their own clear agendas, and historians treat the precise choreography of the scene with appropriate caution, even while accepting that Boniface was captured, threatened, and held under armed guard inside his own palace. The occupation did not last long. Word spread through Anagni that its own native son, the Pope who had grown up in these streets, was being held captive inside the town walls, and local residents turned on Nagarat's men within roughly 3 days, rising up and driving the invaders out before Philip's plan to haul Boniface north for trial in France could ever be carried out. Boniface was free again, technically, escorted back toward Rome by townspeople who had just saved him from his own supposed protector's failure, and his enemy's ambition alike. Freedom did not mean recovery. Boniface returned to Rome visibly shaken and died roughly a month later. Chroniclers at the time debated whether the shock and public humiliation of the assault had simply broken an old man's spirit and hastened his death, or whether it was unrelated illness that would have killed him regardless. A question modern historians still cannot resolve with full certainty given how thin and partisan the surviving accounts are. What is not in question is what came after him. Within a handful of years, under continued French pressure, the papacy relocated entirely to Avignon in southern France, beginning nearly 70 years during which the Bishop of Rome answered, in practice if never quite in official doctrine, to the French crown. One king's minister and one Italian nobleman's grudge did more damage to papal independence in a single afternoon than centuries of theological argument ever managed. There is a bitter symmetry to how Boniface's own path to the papacy began. His predecessor, a reluctant hermit monk elevated to the papal throne as Celestine V, resigned the position after only a few months, unable to handle the politics of the role, and Boniface, elected in his place, promptly had the elderly former pope arrested and held in confinement for the rest of his life out of fear that a rival faction might try to install him again as a puppet claimant. Celestine died in that captivity in 1296, less than a decade before Boniface himself would be seized inside his own palace by men who felt he had abused the very authority he once used to imprison a harmless old monk who no longer wanted it. Sira Kalana was not simply a hired sword acting on Philip's orders alone. His own family had its own long score to settle. Years earlier, Boniface had waged open war against the Kalana family within Italy itself, stripping them of their cardinalates and razing their stronghold town of Palestrina to the ground during a campaign meant to crush any rival power base inside the church's own territory. For Sira Kalana, marching into Anagni beside Philip's minister was not simply mercenary work for a foreign king. It was the return leg of a private vendetta years in the making, a chance to personally settle a grudge against the very pope who had once tried to erase his entire family's standing in Rome. An old man alone on his throne, struck across the face for defying a king, ended up costing the medieval papacy its independence for the better part of a century. The next kidnapping on this list involves a king so bound by his own sense of honor that he did something almost nobody in his position would ever willingly choose to do. Number 2. The kidnapping of King John II of France. By the middle of the 1350s, the 100 Years' War between England and France had already dragged on for close to 2 decades, and King John II of France, a ruler chroniclers nicknamed John the Good for his personal courage rather than his strategic judgment, was determined to finally crush the English raiding parties that kept tearing through his kingdom. In September of 1356, he cornered what he believed was a much smaller, badly overextended English force near Poitiers, commanded by Edward, the eldest son of the English king, and already known across Europe as the Black Prince. The battle that followed on the 19th of September, 1356, went nothing like John expected. Well-chosen defensive ground, disciplined English archers, and a series of French tactical blunders turned what should have been a straightforward French victory into a catastrophic rout. John himself fought on foot in the thick of it, reportedly with his youngest son Philip fighting at his side, shouting warnings about danger approaching from each flank as the battle collapsed around them. It made no difference. By the end of the day, the King of France himself, along with a substantial portion of his surviving nobility, had been captured on the field. What followed was unlike almost any other royal captivity on this list. John was shipped to England and held in a style closer to an honored, extremely wealthy house guest than a prisoner of war. Lodged first at the Savoy Palace in London, and later at Windsor. Permitted his own retinue, hunting expeditions, and traveling minstrels, all funded, in a detail that says everything about the era's strange rules of chivalry, largely out of his own French royal income that continued reaching him even in captivity. 4 years of negotiation finally produced the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, setting John's ransom at an almost unimaginable 3 million gold crowns, several years' worth of the entire French crown's income, with John released on parole and a group of hostages, including his own son Louis, Duke of Anjou, left behind in England to guarantee payment. In 1363, Louis, worn down by years of comfortable but indefinite captivity with no ransom payment in sight, simply walked away from his English custodians and fled home to France. Most kings in John's position would have treated the escape as good fortune, one less hostage to worry about, one less debt hanging over the crown. John did not see it that way at all. As a matter of personal honor, the same code of chivalry that had put him in the thick of the fighting at Poitiers rather than safely behind his own lines, John insisted that his word to the English crown still bound him even though his son's word did not bind him. And he made the almost unthinkable decision to return voluntarily to captivity in England, to make good on a promise nobody, but he still felt obligated to keep. He sailed back to England in early 1364, received by his former captors with a strange kind of ceremonial respect, reserved for a man who had chosen imprisonment over freedom out of sheer principle. He never left again. John died in London a few months later, still officially a prisoner of the English crown, having spent the final act of his reign proving a point about honor that cost him the rest of his life to make. Almost nobody remembers John II for winning anything. Historians remember him for walking back into a cage because his son had walked out of one, an act of self-imposed captivity, so extreme it stands nearly alone in medieval history. John's devotion to the ideals of chivalry long predated his captivity, and helps explain why he took his broken word so seriously once he was in a position to break it. Years before Poitiers, he had founded a French chivalric order of his own, the Order of the Star, explicitly modeled to rival England's Order of the Garter, built around a formal oath its members swore never to retreat more than a certain distance in battle no matter the cost. An oath so rigid it reportedly got a number of his own knights needlessly killed in earlier fighting, rather than let them break it. A king who had already designed an entire chivalric order around the principle that a sworn word could not be walked back, whatever the cost, was always going to be the kind of prisoner who saw his own ransom parole the exact same way. The chivalric courtesy that framed John's entire captivity was already on display within hours of his capture at Poitiers. The Black Prince, by most contemporary accounts, treated his royal prisoner with a level of respect that startled onlookers on both sides, reportedly serving John personally at a formal dinner the very evening of the battle rather than sitting at his own table, while a defeated king waited on him. an inversion of the normal order between captor and captive that chroniclers on both sides of the Channel found remarkable enough to record in detail. It set the tone for everything that followed, a captivity built more on the elaborate manners of chivalry than on chains, which makes John's later decision to return voluntarily feel less like an isolated act of madness and more like the logical, if extreme, conclusion of a code of honor that had shaped every stage of his imprisonment from the very first night. A king chose a foreign prison over his own freedom rather than break his word, and died there to prove it. Nothing on this list tops that for pure stubborn honor. But one kidnapping still outranks it for sheer cost, because the 10th item on this list already told you how it ends. And now, it is time to go back and see exactly how a king slipping home from a war in disguise turned into the most expensive kidnapping medieval Europe ever paid for. Number 1. The Kidnapping of Richard the Lionheart. Richard the First of England, remembered across the centuries as Richard the Lionheart, had spent years building enemies across the length of the Third Crusade, and one grudge in particular would come back to define the end of his campaign far more than any battle against Saladin's forces ever did. During the Siege of Acre in 1191, Richard publicly insulted Duke Leopold V of Austria by having Leopold's banner torn down from the captured city walls, a calculated humiliation of a fellow crusader that Leopold, prince of one of the most powerful families in the Holy Roman Empire, never forgot and never forgave. Heading home in the winter of 1192, Richard's ship was battered off course by storms in the Adriatic, forcing him to abandon the sea route and attempt an overland crossing through Central Europe instead, territory riddled with men who had personal reasons to want him dead or captured, Leopold's own lands among them. Rather than travel with the full escort and banners of a king, Richard chose to move in disguise, posing as a humble pilgrim or merchant with only a small party, hoping to slip through hostile territory unnoticed on his way back to England. The disguise held for weeks. It fell apart, according to the traditional account, over something almost absurdly small. Near Vienna in December of 1192, a member of Richard's small party attracted suspicion by paying for provisions with a gold coin far too fine for a humble pilgrim to be carrying, or by wearing a ring inconsistent with the rest of his shabby traveling clothes, depending on which version of the story a given chronicler preferred to tell. Whatever the exact detail, it was enough. Local authorities grew suspicious, dug deeper, and eventually confirmed that the King of England himself was traveling through Leopold's territory disguised as nobody in particular. Richard was captured and handed directly to Duke Leopold, the very man he had humiliated at Acre the year before, who now held the King of England as his personal prisoner with an old insult finally settled. Leopold did not keep his prize to himself for long. He passed Richard up the chain to his own overlord, Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who had grievances of his own tied to disputed claims over the Kingdom of Sicily, and was more than happy to take custody of one of Europe's most powerful kings as a bargaining chip. A crowned monarch was, in effect, traded upward between captors like a particularly valuable hostage, each one recognizing exactly how much leverage they now controlled. Richard spent well over a year moved between Henry's castles while negotiations dragged on, and when the terms were finally set, they were staggering. The emperor demanded 150,000 marks of silver, a sum modern historians estimate at somewhere between 2 and 3 times the entire annual royal income of England, quite possibly the largest ransom demanded for a single individual in the whole of medieval European history. Back in England, the burden of raising it fell largely on Richard's formidable mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her 70s and functioning as the effective head of government in her son's absence, who oversaw a fundraising campaign that squeezed every part of the kingdom. A quarter of the value of all movable property was demanded from nobles and commoners alike. Church plate and treasures were melted down across the country. An entire year's wool harvest from England's Cistercian monasteries, one of the kingdom's most valuable exports, was seized outright and sold to help make up the total. While his mother worked to buy his freedom, Richard's own younger brother John was doing the opposite. John had already been maneuvering to seize power in Richard's absence, and according to multiple chroniclers, actively conspired with King Philip II of France, the same Philip who appears earlier on this list working against King John's own later kidnapping victims, to keep Richard locked away as long as possible, reportedly even offering the emperor money of his own to delay a release his own brother's freedom would directly threaten. The king's ransom was, in part, a race against his own family's ambition. Richard did not simply sit passively through his own captivity. In the spring of 1193, he was brought before an assembly of the empire's princes and clergy at Speyer to answer a formal list of accusations Henry had drawn up against him, ranging from conduct during the Crusade to old grievances tied to the murder of a minor Italian noble. Rather than stay silent, Richard defended himself in person, in fluent, forceful Latin, arguing his own case point by point in front of the assembled Reichstag, with enough skill and evident sincerity that several chroniclers report the mood in the hall visibly shifted in his favor. Princes who had arrived, prepared to see a humbled prisoner, instead watching a king argue rings around his accusers. It did not win him his freedom on the spot. It did buy him something almost as valuable, a wave of sympathy across the German nobility that put quiet pressure on Henry to keep the negotiations moving rather than let his prisoner rot indefinitely, while opinion turned against the whole affair. No account of Richard's captivity would be complete without the legend that eventually attached itself to it, the story of the minstrel Blondel, who supposedly wandered from castle to castle across the empire singing a song only he and Richard knew, until one day Richard, hearing it drift up from outside a tower window, sang the matching verse back and revealed his location to the outside world for the first time. It is a wonderful story, and almost certainly not a true one. The tale first appears in sources written well after Richard's lifetime, and Richard's location was, in reality, generally known and openly discussed during the negotiations, rather than a mystery any wandering singer needed to solve. The truth was less romantic and more bureaucratic, a king held as collateral while accountants and clergy on two sides of a continent argued over silver. Richard's homecoming settled one more score before he ever left England again. His brother John, who had spent the entire captivity plotting with the King of France to keep him locked away, expected fury, exile, or worse when Richard finally returned. Instead, according to the chroniclers who recorded the reunion, Richard looked at his kneeling, terrified brother and forgave him almost on the spot, reportedly remarking that John was still only a child led astray by bad advisors. A strikingly generous verdict for a man John had spent over a year actively trying to keep in a foreign prison. It was a mercy that would matter enormously 5 years later, when Richard died without an heir of his own, and the crown passed, without serious contest, to the very brother who had once bet everything on him never coming home at all. The ransom was finally paid in full, and Richard was released in February of 1194, having spent well over a year as the highest value hostage in Europe. He returned briefly to England, held a deliberately theatrical second coronation to publicly reassert his authority after his brother's scheming, and then left almost immediately for continental warfare against Philip of France, never to set foot in England again, before dying from a wound taken at the siege of a minor castle in 1199. A king who survived years of crusade against Saladin's armies came closer to permanent captivity, and cost his kingdom more, over one failed disguise on the road home than he ever did on any battlefield in the Holy Land. 10 kidnappings. 10 courts thrown into chaos by men who reached for a rival, a rule, or a rescue, and instead created a crisis nobody fully controlled again. A favorite dragged from his own escort on a broken promise. A brother locked away for 28 years by the sibling who beat him in the field. A bride taken from a rival that cost an empire. A nephew who vanished so completely no grave has ever been found. A boy king whose father died of grief before his son ever ruled a single free day. A duke who turned a quarter-century of captivity into poetry. A king kidnapped by his cousin and betrayed twice by the same brother. A pope struck across the face who lost his church its independence. A king who chose a foreign prison over his own freedom and died there on principle. And a king brought down not by any army, but by a gold coin spent at the wrong market stall. Different centuries, different kingdoms, different reasons entirely, and yet the same pattern keeps surfacing across all 10. None of these were wars won by armies meeting in open battle and one side simply proving stronger. Almost every one of them turned on a broken oath, a moment of bad luck, or a single loyalty that failed at exactly the wrong second, a guard who looked away, a page who spent the wrong coin, a son who walked out of a cell his father felt honor-bound to walk back into. Royal power in the medieval world looked, from the outside, like something built on armies and castles and crowns passed down through blood. Every single kidnapping on this list shows how thin that armor actually was, how easily an entire kingdom's fate could hinge on whether one man's guard happened to be looking the other way at exactly the wrong moment. Most people picture medieval kings as untouchable, surrounded by walls, armies, and the kind of authority nobody could simply walk up and interrupt. You just watch 10 of the most powerful men in their world get pulled out of their own lives by a broken promise, a betraying family member, or one very small, very human mistake, and watched entire kingdoms bend around the fallout for decades afterward. So pick one. Of all 10 kidnappings on this list, which one do you think reshaped its kingdom the most, and which capture do you think never should have worked in the first place? Say which one, and make the case for it in the comments. And if 10 kidnappings were not enough, subscribe, because the medieval world left plenty more royal courts still waiting to be shaken apart, and there are more of them still waiting to be counted down.